I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation, Invasive Plants That Threaten the Blue Hills. I'm Julia Milo. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Friends of the Blue Hills. So the Friends of the Blue Hills is devoted to preserving and protecting the Blue Hills Reservation's natural beauty, diverse natural habitats, and many recreational opportunities. So the Friends organizes hundreds of volunteers each year to help care for the forests. Tonight, we're thrilled that Arboretum Director Debbie Merriam will be helping us explore the world of invasive plants that live in the Blue Hills and threaten our native plants and animals. You'll also learn how you can join volunteers and members of the Friends of the Blue Hills to control these invasive plants and protect endangered species. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. Debbie will answer questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our presenter, Debbie Merriam. So Debbie's a director at the Merriam Binney Wakefield Arboretum, where she promotes lifelong participatory learning through using the land and resources of the historic Davenport estate on Brush Hill Road in Milton. So through collaborative partnerships with schools and community organizations, the Merriam Binney Wakefield Arboretum provides educational opportunities, tours, presentations, workshops, hands-on training, internships, and other programs covering a variety of subjects, including local history, ecology, horticulture, agriculture, archival work, and historic preservation. Thank you, Debbie. Are you ready to start?
Yes, I'm ready to start.
All right, passing the mic over.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction, Julia. And I really appreciate anyone that tried to log on 2 weeks ago and was not able to for signing up for tonight's presentation. So thank you very much. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about the impact of invasive species in the Blue Hills and also to provide opportunities for members and volunteers to participate in this incredible project. So before I start, I just want to say how I became involved in this. So I am the director of the Merriam Binney Wakefield Arboretum, and we are on Brush Hill in Milton. And we have been a certified arboretum for about 6 years now. And what that means is that we have become accredited for a variety of reasons. And those reasons consist of the fact that we have an amazing woody plant collection of almost 400 different species. We have a management plan, and we've had a lot of invasive species on our own landscape that we've had to deal with over the last, I've been there for 10 years now. We have a collections policy, so how we manage our woody plant collection. And we do a lot of educational programming. And then finally, how I became involved in Friends of the Blue Hills is that through our outreach. So this is a very important part of being a certified arboretum. So we do outreach with not only Friends of the Blue Hills, but Brookwood, Neponset River Watershed, the Bradley Estate, and Trailside Museum, just to name a few. So here's a map of Blue Hills Reservation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this map, as I am. And I put a little red triangle up in the corner here. And this is where the Wakefield Arboretum is. So as you can see, we sit between two large properties associated with the Blue Hills, the Fowl Meadow and the Blue Hills Reservation. So this is the main reason for me that I've gotten very involved with Blue Hills Reservation is that we share the same ecosystem. So we share the same plant material, and we share the same conditions throughout this entire landscape. So it's very important to be involved with understanding how invasive species move through landscapes and ecosystems. And you can't just live in a bubble. So it's important to be able to influence or work with organizations beyond the Arboretum to help think about invasive species and how they move through the landscape and what we can do as a community to control them. So this project began in it's been 3 years now, and it began with the original program, which was Friends of the Blue Hills Invasive Species Tracking Project. And from that, it's moved to Survey and Save the Forest and Adopt a Forest Initiative, which are both Friends of the Blue Hills initiatives. But the idea was originally to survey Punkapog, because Punkapog is a very unique ecosystem. And that was where the project originated. We wrote a grant and we received a grant through DCR to fund this project and track these invasive species. And we chose Punkapog because although the entire Blue Hills Reservation is an incredible ecosystem with an amazing array of various plants and animals, we thought this was important to focus on Punkapog because it's considered an area of ecological importance. And that is because there are many very unique species there because of the bog that exists and because of the various ecosystems that are unique to Punkapog. So before I move into the various species that we're talking about, I want to sort of give you an understanding or a definition of what an invasive species is and why it's so important to think about them beyond, well, just think about them in general, but how they are impacting our native ecosystems. So invasive species are non-native and they seriously can impact the native species. They are harmful to environment, they can be environmentally harmful and they can be harmful to human health. They can also, what I consider the most important aspect is they can dominate the ecosystem. And when they do that, they create a monoculture, and which once they're a monoculture, they can suppress the native species. So in this picture on the left, this is actually at Punkapog. And I like to show this picture because it has a couple of things going on here that might not be clear by the image itself. So what's happening is these are our native ash trees, and they are being impacted by an invasive species known as emerald ash borer. So this invasive species is killing our native ash trees. But at the same time, if you look at the tree on the left, there's a large vine growing up the tree. And this is oriental bittersweet. And this is another invasive species. So not only is the tree impacted by the emerald ash borer, but the invasive oriental bittersweet is growing up into the canopy of the tree and ultimately will kill the tree. So these are native the ash is a native species that has been completely, ash has been very much impacted by the emerald ash borer, but it's also a double impact of the bittersweet. So this is something that's very important to think about, is that there are many aspects of invasives that can culminate in causing problem for our native species. The other thing we need to think about is the impact of climate change. And as we know, the temperatures are warming. And what scientists have found out through this process of studying climate change is a lot of non-native species are better at adapting to climate change. So this gives them an advantage over our native species. So this is another thing to consider when we look at how we're going to manage invasive species and how we're trying to protect our native species. The other thing that we have to think about is the drought impact. So last summer was a very severe drought, and if you hiked in the Blue Hills, you might have noticed that it impacted certain species, and other species were not impacted by it at all. So this is another aspect of things we need to think about. We need to think about temperature, and we need to think about drought, and we need to think about plants' adaptability and whether they're going to be able to handle some of these changes going forward, or it's going to be a problem, and we need to think about how we can come up with solutions to deal with that. So there is some good news when it comes to these things, and that is our native oak trees. And oak trees are what are called a keystone species. They provide food for such a huge variety of animals and insects, everything. And that is because they have evolved over time, and they're native, and they provide, acorns for deer and turkeys and insects for birds and everything. And the reality is that oaks are actually adapting to the changing climate quite well, which is very good news. And the other thing we need to think about is some of the other plants that are adapting that are native. So our native poison ivy, which I know a lot of you don't like to think about as a good plant, but it actually is a very good wildlife plant. It's only bad for humans because we get poison ivy from it. I mean, but otherwise it provides fodder for birds and all kinds of animals. And so we think about something that might be bad for humans, but it's actually very good for wildlife. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about the goals of these projects and collecting data and what the purpose is. So if we collect data about the prevalence of invasive species in the Blue Hills, we have that information, and then we can use that information to develop a management plan to deal with some of these species. And then ultimately, the goal is to use that information to have volunteers with Friends of Blue Hills actually do the remediation of the invasive species. So this has been a process that's been going on for a few years. A lot of the management plan has been approved. And so ultimately going forward, we're going to be able to implement it and have volunteers work to remediate some of these invasive species. So here's just a sample. I mentioned that we focused on Ponkapog, but if you're interested in collecting data, you can collect data anywhere in the Blue Hills Reservation. And this is one of the trails I actually walk on Walcott quite frequently. So I just began collecting some data. So I just want to point out before I go forward that anywhere in the Blue Hills that you are hiking or biking or whatever your exercise is, that you can collect data anywhere and it will be relevant to this project. Okay, so I just want to focus on 8 of the invasive species that we feel are most problematic in the Blue Hills, and some of the identifying features that when you're out hiking that you might be able to pick up on. And then I'll talk about how you can actually collect the data. So we have buckthorn, multiflora rose, black swallowwort, bittersweet, phragmites, garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed, and Japanese barberry. And I also want to say that I spent a lot of time in the Blue Hills, and there are a lot of parts of the Blue Hills that are incredibly healthy forests. So that is wonderful to see. And it's great that there are not a lot of these invasive species in a lot of parts of the forest. And so the goal of this project also is to make sure that that stays that way, that we can keep some of these invasive species under control so they don't spread to other parts of the Blue Hills. So the first one I want to talk a little bit about is buckthorn. And buckthorn is a very interesting plant because there are many different kinds of buckthorn, and that's why you need to put the Latin name. So there are native buckthorns, but the problem with the buckthorn in the Blue Hills is most of the time it's the non-native Rhamnus cathartica. And there are a couple of identifying features that are very unique. It has this black fruit and a very glossy leaf. And then on the image on the right, this is the stem, and it has what's called lenticels that are very prominent. So lenticels are like pores. They allow gas exchange in a tree. And on buckthorn, they're very prominent. So they're little polka dots and they stick out. So this is something that's an easily identifying feature in the plant. But the most important feature of the Rhamnus cathartica is if you look closely at the buds, they're very pointed. So obviously you can only see this in the early to late spring when the buds are prominent, but they're very pointed, hence the name buckthorn. Now, what's interesting about buckthorn and actually several other non-native species. So if you look at the overstory in this image, you can see that the trees have no leaves. So these are deciduous trees. They've dropped their leaves, but unfortunately, the understory, which is buckthorn, maintains its leaves. So this is another easy way to find buckthorn. So if you're walking in the forest in November, December, January, you can see that this plant is still in full leaf. And we had this experience at the YMCA camp. I worked with a group of UMass students over there. And we went in late October, and it was very easy to identify the buckthorn because it was still in full leaf. The other problem in this is if you think about the fact that there's no leaves in the above the buckthorn, so it's still photosynthesizing. So it continues to photosynthesize late into the fall, and then it also leaves out earlier. So it has an advantage over the native species because it's photosynthesizing longer, it's growing faster. So this is an interesting aspect of some non-native species because their life cycles are not attuned to our environment. So that actually gives them an advantage. The next one is bittersweet, Celastris, and this was brought here to the United States as an ornamental plant, and many people still use the berries in decorations at the holidays, but this is a very problematic plant. There is also a native bittersweet. I have seen it only once, and it's being outcompeted by the non-native species. So bittersweet is a vine, and it actually has the capacity to strangle plants. So the image on the right, you can see it's actually cutting in through the bark, where everything is happening in the plant. And so it can ultimately kill native species by actually strangling it and stopping the flow of energy for photosynthesis through the bark of the tree. Now, I love this image. It's a great shot, but this is, we have had bittersweet like this at the Arboretum. Fortunately, so far, we've been able to control it. But this is how you actually would deal with a plant like this. You need to just cut it at the base. And if you can stop it from sending energy up and down through the plant, you have a better chance of stopping the impact of this intense problem. And I think bittersweet is probably one of the largest impactful invasive species in New England. The next one I want to talk about is Phragmites, and Phragmites only appears in places that are wet because it's a bamboo or reed plant, and it needs water to survive. So there are patches of Phragmites around Ponkapog and other parts of the Blue Hills, but it needs water. And this is an invasive species, and it takes the place of our native cattails. And cattails are very important for certain species of wildlife. So this is a very problematic plant. And it's very easily identifiable because it's about 10 feet tall. It kind of looks like a corn stalk, and it has this flower at the top, sort of late in July, August, and September. But the interesting thing about this plant is that when so this is in the Meadowlands in New Jersey, and it has the capacity to take in nitrogen and different kinds of pollution and actually purify it. So it's kind of an interesting aspect to think about when you're talking about certain invasive species. Are there certain aspects that are helpful to the environment? And this is one aspect where it actually is doing a good job in some place like the Meadowlands, which are very polluted. So we also need to think about that when we talk about invasive species. Now, here's the next one, multiflora rose, and this was very common at Ponkapog, but to be honest with you, it's a plant that needs light and a fair amount of sunlight. So when you're in the woods and different parts of the reservation, you're not likely to see this plant. So an easy identifier is that it has a white flower, and the native one has a pink flower. But the most important way to identify multiflora rose is this. It's very easy. If you just look at the leaves, it has a little hair at the base of the stem. So the native swamp rose does not have these hairs. And so I've taken a bunch of groups around and looking for multiflora rose, and everyone is able to identify these little hairs that really show you that it's not the non-native species. Okay, the next one is garlic mustard. And this is a big one. Friends of Blue Hills has done a lot of work, especially around the AMC camp, to remove this plant. And it was another plant that was brought here as an ornamental. It's very pretty. It has this very pretty white flower, and you can actually make pesto with it. It has a sort of garlicky flavor to it, but it is very aggressive. It can live in sun and shade, and what it has the capacity. It's what we call ileopathy. So it secretes a light, say, poison, so other plant material cannot grow around it. So it's extremely important to remove this plant when we see it. The other issue is garlic mustard is known as a biennial. So it has a 2-year life cycle. So this is what it looks like in the first year. So it doesn't produce a flower, and the flowers are what you have to think about with plants: flowers and seed production, because when they produce flowers and they produce seed, that's how they spread. But you can recognize it. Its first year, it looks like this. In fact, it's still going right in the middle of winter. It can survive the very cold weather. So if you're walking around, you might be able to see some of the first year of the garlic mustard. So it's important to think about, if it's in the first year, you don't need to remove it because it's not producing seed. The second year it produces the seed, and that's when it has to be removed. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is black swallowwort. Now, this is very problematic plant. I have not seen a lot of it in the Blue Hills Reservation. Please, if you have seen it, write it in the chat, because it is very problematic. I have seen some up around the observatory, and they are spraying for it there. But it is a vine, and it produces these very long pods, and these pods can produce thousands and thousands of seeds. So once it sets seeds and it spreads through the air, and it is very aggressive, a very aggressive plant, and it's very difficult to remove. So if you know of any other place or in the Blue Hills and you've seen it, this is a very problematic plant. It's called black swallowwort because what it does, it attracts swallowtail butterflies, because it has a flower that's very similar to native species that they depend on. They lay their eggs on the plant, and then the eggs hatch, and they can't consume the plant material because it's toxic to them. So this is a very important plant to remove, because it's suppressing our native butterflies that are very important. The next one is Japanese barberry, and this one was not on our list of invasive species to focus on, because the DCR ecologists did not think it was problematic enough. However, when we were doing our research and our data collection, we came across a fair amount of Japanese barberry. And Japanese barberry is an interesting plant. It's still sold as an ornamental in nurseries. It's very thorny. It has these berries here on the left. They're quite lovely. It comes in a variety of colors. So it's actually very quite common for to see it in people's gardens and landscapes. And it's because it's also very deer tolerant. Deer will not eat it. However, this is a very problematic plant for a variety of reasons. It produces a lot of fruit, and birds eat the fruit, but our native birds actually can't digest it because it's a non-native plant. So they poop it out pretty readily, and then that's how it spreads. But the other reason it's very problematic, and I want to talk about this just briefly, is because it's the perfect home for white-footed mice. And the reality is, people think that deer are the reason that we have Lyme disease, but white-footed mice are the vector for Lyme disease. So a tick has to bite a white-footed mouse in order to carry Lyme disease. And so once the tick has bitten the white-footed mouse, it usually tries to hop onto a deer, and that's how it's moved through the landscape. But the reality is the white-footed mouse is the problem. And barberry and other non-native species are perfect homes for white-footed mice. And that's because animals don't eat the plant. It stays quite warm and moist underneath, and they have a constant source of food, which is the fruit from the plant itself. So it's important to think about other impacts that some of these non-native species can have, and Lyme disease is one that certain species have a tendency to promote. Okay, so I just went through all of those plants rather quickly, just to give you a general understanding of what they look like when you're out in hiking, so you might be able to see them. But now I just want to talk about how we collected our data. And if you are interested in joining this project, you can do this as well. So we used iNaturalist, and this is an amazing citizen science application. It's used by scientists throughout the world. It's used by people that are interested in learning about a variety of anything that's living. You can find everything from variety of fungus to animals to plants. So I highly recommend, if you've never heard of it, to take a look at it. It's free to use. And once you get on it, you can see all kinds of things and all kinds of information that you would be interested in as somebody that's interested in Friends of the Blue Hills. So what I'm going to go through this briefly, and we can talk about it more in the chat at the end, or we can ask questions. But what you do is you download the application iNaturalist onto your phone. And I like to look at it on my computer because you can look at all the maps, which are really interesting. And then you join the application, which is free, and then you create an account, like anything that you would do, Google, it's very similar. And then what you do is it's gonna let you go join some projects. So you would look at Friends of the Blue Hills Survey and Save the Forest. That is the project that we're focusing on right now. And then you open it and you join. So pretty straightforward. It's a very user-friendly app, and both for Android and iPhone, any kind of phone you have, it works very well. Okay, so you download, you create an account, and then once you create an account, what you would do is you would walk around the woods, and if you see a plant or an animal or anything that you're interested in, you just take a picture, and you take a picture of that. And then what's really incredible about this application, it will show you what it thinks it is. So you can say, I don't know what this is, and it will make some recommendations, and then you can start making the comparison. So this has been very helpful. We've had, I think so far we've had over 200 volunteers involved in this project, and we've had something like over 2,000 observations made. So every time someone makes an observation, the application sort of checks on it. But then also there's this incredible group of scientists looking at the data. So they're going to look at the images that you've taken and say, well, I don't know if that's a barberry or whatever. But then, so they're going to say, oh yeah, that's definitely a barberry. You took a photo of the fruit, you got the leaf, and it will affirm that what you saw was correct. So not only are you taking this information, but there are people looking at it. There's one person that just looks at bittersweet. It's a hobby. He's a scientist. He's interested in bittersweet. So he just goes through the images of bittersweet and confirms whether it's bittersweet or not. So this is the amazing world of this application. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are several Friends of the Blue Hills Survey and Save the Forest. We started originally, the project was called the Friends of the Blue Hills Invasive Species Tracking Project. And that's where we got all of the data for Punkapog. So once we collected all of that data for Punkapog, I looked at the data, I decided and worked with the DCR ecologist where the areas of most important management needed to occur. And then we actually wrote a management plan, and the management plan is most of it has been approved. So now actually volunteers and other organizations go in and they actually are doing the management of these species. So that's why this is so important. You have this incredible amount of data. You can decide where multiflora rose is a problem or Phragmites is a problem, and how we're going to go about removing this safely, and how Friends of the Blue Hills members and volunteers can be involved in this project. And then going forward, the new initiative is Adopt a Forest initiative. And this is a much larger program, and it is it's being worked on by Friends of the Blue Hills, but ultimately you will be able to join an Adopt the Forest initiative, and you will be able to go and help remediate some of these invasive species in certain areas of the reservation. Okay. So this is just, you can, as I mentioned, you can collect data anywhere in the reservation, and this will ultimately inform management throughout the reservation, which is extremely important. Citizen science has proven to be one of the most useful tools for collecting data in large areas. As we know, DCR is not, they do not have the resources to cover all of the land that they manage throughout Massachusetts. So this is a great opportunity for people to be involved in helping understand where problems are in the Blue Hills, and how ultimately we can collect data and impact management strategies. And that is the end of the presentation. And so, Julia, you want to open up and I can take some questions and comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that great presentation. That was awesome. I feel like I learned a lot. And it was cool to see the close-up picture of the multiflora rose. You could see the little hairs. So let's take a look at the Q&A section. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and drop it in the Q&A. So our first question is from Rachel. Do the buckthorn leaves stay green all winter? I see lots of small leaf trees in the Blue Hills during the winter, but they have orangish leaves. I think they may be beech.
Excellent question. Yes. So ultimately, buckthorn loses its leaves in late January, depending. I mean, the leaves are gone. And that's an excellent question. So certain trees maintain their leaves, and mostly beech and oak, and that is something known as marquescence. And it's a very interesting evolutionary fact, is that, well, it's a scientific theory. So the reason that they maintain their leaves through the winter is scientists believe that they are primary food sources for deer. So deer are browsers. They don't just eat grass, they eat a lot of twigs and branches. And through the winter, they fatten up on oak acorns in the fall. And through the winter, they depend on young, new shoots on oaks and beeches, because that's a good source of food for them, a lot of carbohydrates. So they think actually oaks and beeches have evolved to keep those brittle leaves on, to keep the animals from browsing on them, because they do not like to eat the brittle leaves. They just want to eat the delicious little shoots. So that's why you see those leaves on young oaks and young beech trees. But buckthorn has lost their leaves by this point, yes.
Excellent answer. It's so informative. We have another question. So how do these invasive plants get into the woods?
So that's a great question. Invasive species have moved throughout. They move throughout the world. We have invasives here, and we have other countries have invasive plants that come here, and they've moved there. But the reality is, most plants have come into the U.S. either as ornamental plants or through shipping. That's the reality, is that when we move goods back and forth, we're such an international, everything is moving around the world. Things get on boats, they move around, and then seed is very amazing. It can survive many different environments, and it gets spread that way. The important thing to think about is invasive species depend on sun. So as soon as there's an opening in the canopy, in the trees, and wherever you see an opening, this is an opportunity for invasive species to take over very quickly. And that's usually how they spread very quickly. They get some sun, the seed is in the soil, whether it's been blown, whether it's been taken there, and then ultimately they grow very quickly, and then they spread very quickly. Because you think about it, they have come from another place. They don't have anything that's eating them. They just don't have any enemies, right? Think about that. So if they don't have any enemies, they're much more likely to thrive in this country. And in these places like the Blue Hills.
Yeah, absolutely. In the open space. So we have some more questions rolling in. Jill is asking, have you been doing invasive removal projects with volunteers, which we have as well. So I don't know if you want to answer that or if you want me to answer that.
Yeah, well, you go ahead, Julie, you answer.
Yeah, so we actually do invasive removals usually like all summer. Once the plants start growing, we can get in there. So we do weeding Wednesdays, and then we also offer some opportunities on the weekends. But mostly I feel like we spent a lot of time removing Milominate, but we removed a lot of different invasive plants. So we'll be posting those opportunities really soon. We're doing our event planning for the season in the coming month. So those will be up on our calendar. So if you're interested in doing invasive removals, you can sign up on the calendar on the Friends of the Blue Hills website. So that's that. And then we can move on to the next question. Does Oriental bittersweet start out as bright green vines with long, sharp thorns? I can see thick, older bittersweet vines, but there are also thin green vines.
Great question. So this is bittersweet does not have thorns, and I think you're confusing this with a native species that's what I would call an aggressive native, and this is greenbrier, and it's fairly prolific in different parts of the Blue Hills. So it is thorny, and the vines they stay green year round, and it can grow up into the canopy, but it usually stays lower. There's a bunch of it right on 138, right below the ski hill. But this is a native plant, so we're not so concerned about it. And also is a good wildlife plant. It produces fruit, but it's what we call aggressive. So there are efforts to remove greenbrier in certain parts of Blue Hills. But it's not a high priority because it is a native species. And so that's a great question. Bittersweet looks very different from greenbrier as a young plant. Bittersweet is much more woody, and greenbrier is it's a woody plant, but it's greener and softer than bittersweet.
Absolutely. Thank you, Debbie. We have a lot of questions rolling in, so I'm not sure if we can get to all of them, but we can keep going. What role does deer overbrowsing play in opening the forest to invasives?
This is a big issue. So deer, historically, deer have not been that big of a problem because people used to hunt deer, and right through the 70s and 80s, deer were not a big problem, but hunting has pretty much stopped in this area. I mean, there's a few people that hunt. And so we've had basically a deer explosion. And deer, as I mentioned, browse on young trees, and they browse on young native trees particularly, and they do not browse invasive species. So what they're doing is they're browsing our native oak species, beech, hickory, and so as they browse those native species, it gives the invasive species a much better opportunity to thrive. So this is a big issue. There needs to be a sort of balance in nature. As always, I always harken back to Native Americans. They would hunt and they would keep the deer population in control, but they were also very careful about their farming methods. They also did some burning. They burn certain parts of the forest so they could hunt more easily, but that would also give them an opportunity to grow some crops. But basically, I feel like nature has gotten out of balance. So the deer population has gotten too large. And so they're browsing a lot of this young plant material that's native, and then the non-native plant material has a much better opportunity to thrive in that environment.
Yeah, excellent, very comprehensive answer. So we can do probably 2 or 3 more questions. So how do you dispose / remove mustard greens once flowering, is this question.
That's a great question also. So this is the issue. So once a plant produces fruit or flowering, that's your biggest problem. When it produces the flower, garlic mustard produces thousands of seeds, and they are viable for up to 8 or 9 years. So what we do is at Wakefield, when we have garlic mustard, we put it under black plastic. So it raises the temperature and it kills the seed. You cannot put it, we have compost. We do a lot of mulching and composting of all our own plant material. But if it's a non-native species and it's producing seed or fruit, you need to kill it by raising the temperature to a certain level, I don't know it. I can't remember exactly the temperature. And if you can't do that, you can dispose of it. And sometimes you can put it in a dumpster. But the reality is you do not want to put it in a compost, because that's the biggest problem. You can also just put it on a big tarp and out in the sun. That will ultimately kill it, as long as you're not putting it back into the soil.
All right. Good to know. Good to know. And then I think this might have to be our final question. Do you ever plant natives to help compete and prevent invasives from coming back?
Yeah, so this is a great point. And this is something we've been talking with the DCR ecologist about. We're doing all this work at Punkapog to remove the non-native species, right? So you have, this is a long-term goal. You can't just do it once. It has to be something that happens over time. So you want to remove the invasive species, but then you have this empty space, right? So you want natives to come back in. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can plant native species, which can be quite expensive, or you can just keep going back year after year and manage the invasive species so the native species have a chance to thrive. So if native species will thrive if they're not being outcompeted by non-native species. So as long as you can manage the non-native species, the native species will ultimately come back on their own. We've done experimental plots at Wakefield, and it's amazing to see. I mean, we have cleared areas over several years, and then all of a sudden we start seeing native plants coming back in. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the road. It's something that's continuing over time. You just have to keep doing it. But ultimately, the natives will thrive if we're managing for that end goal.
Awesome. Excellent. So actually, we do have a little bit more time on the webinar. I just double checked, so we can probably keep going with questions. Let's see. Milominate is very invasive. How do I remove it?
Yeah. So milominate I did not talk about, because that is a big issue, but it's mostly in foul meadow, and that is below us. And we have milominate. It came from the foul meadow. We'd never had this plant before, and all of a sudden it popped up, and it was kind of amazing. But The thing about Mile a Minute is it's very easy to remove. Just wear gloves. It can irritate your skin. It has little thorns on it, but you need to remove it before it produces fruit, because that is how it spreads. So if you can pull it up in, I think it's, we start looking for it in July, and we start seeing it come up, and you can just pull it out. It's very easy to remove. And if you can remove it before it produces fruit, then you can put it in your compost. But if it's already producing fruit, you need to do something else with it, because it will ultimately spread that way. So it's just easiest to just pull it out, make sure you wear gloves, and you can definitely suppress it that way. Yeah.
Excellent. So someone asked, I'm looking at the app, is sweet pepper bush invasive? There is a lot of it in my part of the reservation.
Sweet pepper bush is not invasive, no.
All right. Do you find any Japanese knotweed in the Blue Hills?
Yes. This is a very scary plant for me, because if you know this plant, it's a beautiful plant, and that's why it was brought here as an ornamental plant. And it produces thousands of seeds because it produces beautiful flowers. I've started seeing it on the ski slope because it's nice and sunny, and there's a lot of it there. Beyond that, I have not seen it in the Blue Hills, but I don't get to all parts. But Japanese knotweed is a plant that prefers sun, although I have seen it growing in shade, and it's extremely difficult to get rid of. That's why it's so scary to see it. It was brought here as erosion control on the side of highways, and it works very well, but it's a very problematic plant. So I have seen it around the ski area, yes.
Yeah. Some people are saying they've seen it in other places as well, so good to know. All right, and then our last question so far said, which of our US species are considered invasive, and in what countries are they noted and studied? I don't know if you know this off the top of your head.
That's a great question. To be honest with you, I don't know. I'm sure there are many of them, but it is good to think about this, because it's a two-way street, right? It's not just invasive plants coming from other parts of the world. It's because plants evolve. So our native plants have evolved over a long period of time. So they have predators, they have, they are feeding a lot of our native plants and I mean our native pests, I'm sorry, insects and birds and everything. And so they've evolved together. So they provide each other the perfect ecosystem. And then we bring plants in from the outside, and they don't provide anything for our native birds and insects and everything. So this is the same thing when our plants go to other places. So you need to think about how plants have evolved over time and animals have evolved over time. So things that have evolved together support each other, but if they have not evolved together, they do not support each other. If you're really interested in this topic, there's some great, Doug Talmy wrote this amazing book about the nature of oaks. It's fascinating because oaks are, as I mentioned, a keystone species, and they provide so much for all species that are here. But the Norway maple that has come, it's a non-native species. It doesn't provide anything for any of our native species. So this is another reason why it's also important to plant native species and think about the fact that if they haven't evolved together, they really don't serve each other very well. That's basic.
Someone commented that ragweed is currently invasive in France, and they're trying to control it. So
see, there we go.
Very cool. So someone asked, are all these species identified in the Blue Hills section of the iNaturalist app? If not, could you share the photos in the slide deck?
Yes, they are all identified in the app. Yes. Other ones as well.
Yeah. All right. If anyone has any more questions, we can do that in the Q&A section. Going once, going twice. And yeah. So I would say that's about it. Thank you all so much for coming. It was so great to have that kind of turnout. What's the name of the project on iNaturalist? Sorry, that we just had a question roll in. Is it the Blue Hills Invasive?
So you guys prefer if you use Survey and Save the Forest. We use
Okay.
this invasive species project for the Punkapog project, but going forward, we're focusing on putting your data into Survey and Save the Forest. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. And yeah, that's about it. That brings us to the end of the presentation. Oh, black swallow wart keeps coming back every season. Any tips for removal?
Yeah, so it's very difficult. I don't recommend I don't recommend using chemicals. But just keep pulling it and make sure it doesn't fruit, because the fruiting is the issue. So if you can pull it before it fruits, that's the key. Yeah.
All right. Survey and Save the Forest isn't showing up. Naturals meet only the invasive species traction. You know what? In the thank you email, we'll see if we can put a link so that everyone can have access to it, because it's easier that way. So we can see if we can just put the link right in so everyone can click on it and have access to it.
You can also put it in. What we're going to do is take the data from Blue Hills Invasive Species Project and put it into Survey and Save the Forest. That's what's amazing about this application. We can combine the two. So if you have an issue, it's totally fine to put it in the other one.
All right. Yeah, good to know. Thank you, guys. I can see everyone saying thank you in the chat. Have a great night, everyone. All right. Bye.
Thank you.